They said the cowboy hadn't spoken a single word in 7 years, but no one ever asked what kind of silence he was keeping. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Somewhere quiet, I hope. Somewhere the wind still sounds like it means something. Out here, silence isn't empty. It's heavy. It carries things a man ain't ready to say. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of his land, boots planted in dry Texas dirt that hadn't seen rain in weeks, the late afternoon sun cutting long shadows across the pasture like it was trying to stretch time itself. His hat sat low, same as always, casting his eyes in shadow, and if you passed him on the road, which nobody did, you might think he just didn't care to talk. But that wasn't it. Not even close. The fence in front of him creaked in the wind, old wood rubbing against rusted wire, a tired sound that matched everything about the place. 12 head of cattle grazed slow and quiet, the only living things that stayed. They didn't ask questions. That's why they lasted. The ranch house behind him leaned slightly to the west, like it had given up arguing with the years. One window was cracked. The door hung a little loose on its hinges. Still, everything was in its place. Always was. Ethan kept it that way. Order without noise. That was the rule now. A hawk circled overhead, cutting through the pale sky, and somewhere in the distance, a loose shutter tapped rhythmically against a neighboring structure long abandoned. The kind of sound that would drive most men crazy. But not Ethan. He'd made peace with sounds that didn't expect answers. Then it came. Not loud. Not sudden. Just wrong. A shift in the air. A break in the pattern. His hand stilled where it rested on the fence post, fingers rough, scarred from years of work that never asked him to speak. He didn't turn right away. Didn't react like most would. That was the thing about men who lived in silence, they noticed everything, but they chose when it mattered. Another second passed. Then 2. The wind slowed, just enough to let something else rise through it. Footsteps. Light. Uneven. Not from the road. From the open land. That alone didn't make sense. Nobody crossed this stretch unless they had nowhere else left to go. Ethan turned his head slightly, just enough to catch movement at the edge of his vision. A figure. Small against the horizon. Moving toward him, but not steady. Not strong. The sun caught on something near her neck, a brief glint, silver maybe, gone as quick as it came. She stumbled once. Kept going. Another step. Then slower. Ethan watched, unmoving, the way a man watches a storm roll in when he already knows there's nowhere to run. He didn't reach for his rifle. Didn't call out. Didn't do anything at all. That was his way. The figure came closer, close enough now to see dark hair tangled by wind, dust clinging to the edges of a worn dress, and something else, something off in the way she held her arms, like she was carrying more than just her own weight. 10 yards out, she stopped. Not by choice. Her knees gave just slightly, like the ground had decided it was time. For a moment, she looked up. Their eyes met across the dry space between them. Hers were sharp. Tired, but not broken. And in that single glance, something shifted. Not in her. In him. Then she collapsed forward into the dirt, the sound soft, almost swallowed by the wind, like the land itself was trying to keep it quiet. Ethan didn't move. Not yet. The silence stretched between them, thicker now, heavier than before. The kind of silence that waits. The kind that knows something just changed, even if no one said a word. The dust settled slowly around where she had fallen, fine grains lifting and drifting in the fading light like the land itself was deciding whether to remember her or let her disappear into it, and Ethan Cole stood there with his hand still resting on the fence, eyes fixed on the shape in the dirt, not with shock, not even with concern, but with that same quiet calculation he had carried for years. The kind that came from living too long without needing anyone and knowing exactly what it cost to change that, and for a long moment he did nothing at all, because doing nothing had kept him alive this long, had kept everything simple, clean, silent, but the wind shifted again, brushing loose strands of her dark hair across her face, and something about that small, human movement broke the stillness just enough to reach him, not loudly, not forcefully, just enough, and he stepped forward, one slow step at a time, boots pressing into dry ground that cracked faintly under his weight, closing the distance without urgency, without hesitation either, until he stood a few feet away, looking down at her as the last light caught the edge of her cheek, her breathing shallow but steady, visible in the slight rise and fall of her shoulders, and he crouched carefully, movements controlled, like he was approaching something fragile he did not yet understand, his shadow falling over her as he studied her face, the lines of dust and travel marking where she had come from, the faint tension still held in her brow even in unconsciousness, and then he saw it again, the glint he had noticed before, half hidden beneath her collar, a thin chain of worn silver resting against her skin, catching what little sunlight remained, and his hand paused in the air just above it, not touching, not yet, as if even that small contact carried weight he was not ready to bear, and for a brief second something moved behind his eyes, not memory fully formed, just a flicker, a shape of something long buried, and then it was gone, and he shifted his attention back to the present, to the reality in front of him, because that was the rule he had built his life on, do not look back, do not open doors that were closed for a reason, but still he reached down, not for the chain, not for anything symbolic, just for her wrist, 2 fingers pressing lightly against her pulse, steady, alive, and he let out a breath so quiet it barely disturbed the air, the kind of breath a man takes when he confirms something he was not ready to lose, and then he noticed the way her hand was curled, not relaxed but holding onto something invisible, and gently, carefully, he turned it just enough to see, a small piece of cloth caught between her fingers, torn at the edge, worn from use. Nothing valuable, nothing that should matter. And yet she held it like it was the only thing she had left, and Ethan studied it for a second longer than necessary before letting her hand rest again against the dirt, and he looked up toward the horizon, toward the distant line where the land met the sky, and there it was, faint but unmistakable, a thin trail of dust rising far off, too straight to be wind, too steady to be anything but riders, and he did not need to count them to know it would not be 1 or 2, because trouble never traveled alone out here, it gathered, it built, it arrived in numbers, and the timing was wrong, too close, too precise, and his gaze dropped back to the woman at his feet, to the chain at her neck, to the way she had walked until she could not anymore, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan Cole stood between 2 choices that both required something from him he had sworn never to give again, and the silence around him shifted, not broken, not yet, but no longer untouched, and without a word, he reached down and lifted her, one arm steady beneath her shoulders, the other supporting her weight, rising with the same quiet strength he carried through everything, and turned toward the house, the old boards creaking slightly as he stepped onto the porch, the door still hanging loose, still waiting, like it always had, and this time, he did not hesitate before pushing it open. The door groaned low as it opened, a tired sound that seemed louder than it should have in a house that had forgotten voices, and Ethan stepped inside without slowing, carrying her across the threshold like he had done it 100 times before, even though he had not carried anyone in years, the air inside cooler, still, holding the faint scent of old wood, leather, and something like dust that had settled into the bones of the place. And he moved straight to the narrow bed against the far wall, setting her down with care that did not show in his face but lived in the way his hand supported her weight until the very last second, making sure she did not fall, did not jar, did not wake too suddenly, and when she was finally resting, he stepped back, just 1 pace, like he needed distance to see clearly again, and the silence returned, but it was not the same silence as before, not clean, not untouched, it carried something now, something breathing, and he stood there watching her for a moment longer than necessary, her face softer in the dim light that slipped through the cracked window, the lines of tension easing just slightly now that she was no longer forcing herself forward, and his gaze dropped again to the chain at her neck, that same dull silver catching what little light there was, and this time he did reach toward it, slow, deliberate, fingers hovering before finally brushing against the metal, just enough to turn it, just enough to see the small marking etched into its surface, worn by time but still there, still unmistakable, and something inside him tightened, not sharp, not sudden, but deep, like a memory pressing against a door he had kept closed for too long, and his hand stilled, then pulled away, not because he did not recognize it, but because he did, and that recognition carried weight he was not ready to carry yet, and he turned from it, moving instead to the basin near the wall, pouring water from a dented tin pitcher into a shallow bowl, the sound quiet but steady, grounding, and he returned to her side, dipping a cloth into the water before wringing it out slowly, methodically, each movement measured, controlled, and he cleaned the dust from her face with the same care he gave everything he chose to touch, not rushing, not lingering either, just enough, and when he was done, he set the cloth aside and stepped back again, his eyes shifting toward the window where the light had begun to fade into something softer, evening settling across the land. And outside, that thin trail of dust had grown, no longer distant, no longer uncertain, shapes beginning to form within it, riders, several of them, moving with purpose, and Ethan watched them without expression, without reaction, but something in the set of his shoulders changed, not tense, not afraid, just decided, and he turned back toward the room, toward the woman on the bed, toward the chain that still rested against her collarbone. And for a moment he stood there between two worlds again. The one outside coming closer with every passing second, and the one inside asking something of him he had not given in a long time, and then she moved, just slightly, a small shift of her hand against the worn blanket, fingers tightening as if reaching for something that was no longer there, a quiet sound escaped her, not a word, not fully formed, just a fragment of breath shaped by memory, and Ethan froze, not because of the sound itself, but because of what it carried, something familiar in its rhythm, something that brushed against the edges of a past he had buried deep, and slowly, almost without thinking, he stepped closer again, his hand hovering near hers, not touching, just there, close enough to feel the warmth. And for the first time since he had brought her inside, he did not look away. The last light of day stretched thin across the wooden floor, slipping through the cracked window in long golden lines that barely reached the far wall, and Ethan remained where he stood beside the bed, his hand still hovering near hers, close enough to feel the warmth that proved she was still here, still breathing, still real, and yet he did not close that final inch of distance, as if even the smallest contact might pull him somewhere he had spent years avoiding, and outside. The distant rhythm of hooves grew clearer, no longer hidden by wind or distance, a steady approach that carried intention, not wandering travelers, not lost men, but a group that knew exactly where they were going, and Ethan turned his head slightly, just enough to listen, just enough to measure the space between now and what was coming, and then he moved, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain, stepping away from the bed and crossing the room toward the window, his boots quiet against the worn boards, and he placed his hand against the frame, leaning just enough to see past the reflection of his own shadow, the riders now visible as shapes against the fading horizon, 6 of them, maybe more behind, their pace controlled, deliberate, and he studied them the way he studied everything, not with fear, not with anger, just with the calm attention of a man who understood that trouble did not need to be loud to be dangerous, and for a moment, just a moment, it would have been easier to step outside, to meet them halfway, to end whatever was coming before it reached his door, but his eyes shifted back to the room behind him, to the bed, to the woman who had brought all of this with her without saying a single word, and he stayed where he was, choosing the inside over the outside, the unknown over the familiar, and that choice settled into the air like something final, something that could not be undone, and behind him, she stirred again, this time stronger, her breath catching slightly as consciousness began to return in fragments, her fingers tightening against the blanket, searching for something solid, something real, and Ethan turned back, his movement quiet but immediate, drawn not by urgency but by something deeper, something he had not named yet, and her eyes opened slowly, dark and sharp even through the haze, scanning the room in quick, instinctive movements before landing on him, and for a second neither of them moved, the space between them filled with questions neither one would ask, and she pushed herself up just slightly, enough to show she was aware, enough to show she was not as weak as she had seemed, and her gaze flicked to the door, then to the window, calculating, measuring, understanding more than she should in so little time, and when her eyes returned to him, there was no fear in them, only caution, only distance, and she spoke, her voice rough but steady, shaped by dust and exhaustion yet carrying strength beneath it, asking a question he did not need to hear to understand, who are you, what is this place, why am I here, and Ethan did not answer, not because he could not, but because the words did not come, not easily, not anymore, and he simply stood there, meeting her gaze without flinching, without offering explanation, and something in her expression shifted, not surprise, not confusion, but recognition, as if she understood that his silence was not empty, that it was chosen, held, protected, and she exhaled slowly, leaning back just enough to ease the tension in her shoulders, her hand moving instinctively to the chain at her neck, fingers brushing against it like a habit she did not think about, and Ethan saw the way she held it. The way it mattered, and the distance between them seemed to narrow just slightly, not enough to trust, not enough to change anything yet, but enough to begin, and outside, the sound of hooves reached the edge of his land, close now, close enough that the silence inside the house no longer belonged to just the two of them, and for the first time since she had opened her eyes, Ethan shifted his stance, turning just enough to place himself between her and the door, not blocking her, not trapping her, but standing there all the same, like a line drawn quietly in the dust that no one had spoken about, but both of them understood. The sound reached the porch first, hooves slowing against dry earth, leather creaking, metal brushing faintly in the quiet, and then it stopped, not abruptly, not uncertain, just a deliberate pause that settled over the land like a held breath, and inside the house, Ethan did not move from where he stood between the door and the bed, his posture unchanged, steady, grounded, as if he had already decided that whatever came next would meet him exactly where he was, and behind him, she had gone. Still again, not from weakness this time, but from awareness, her eyes shifting toward the door, her body angled slightly as if preparing for something she had seen before, something she understood better than he did, and her fingers tightened once more around the chain at her neck, a small motion but not unnoticed, and Ethan saw it without turning, felt it in the air more than anything, that quiet signal of importance, of connection, and then came the first knock. Not loud, not aggressive. Just firm, controlled, the kind of knock that expected to be answered, and it echoed through the wood of the door and into the room, where it seemed to linger longer than it should have, and Ethan did not answer, not immediately, not out of defiance but because silence had always been his first response, his only response, and the knock came again, slightly heavier this time, followed by a voice from the other side, calm but edged with something that did not ask twice, calling out without shouting, asking for a man who had not spoken in years, and Ethan's gaze shifted once, just once, toward the woman behind him, and their eyes met again, hers sharper now, clearer, searching his face for something, a decision, a sign, anything that told her which side of the door he belonged to, and for a second longer than it should have been, neither of them moved, neither of them spoke, and the silence between them held everything that needed to be said, everything that could not be said. And then Ethan turned, slow, deliberate, stepping toward the door with the same measured pace he used for everything, not hurried, not hesitant, just certain, and each step carried weight, not from fear, but from the understanding that this moment would not pass quietly no matter what he chose, and when he reached the door, his hand rested on the handle but did not open it yet, not before he listened one last time, not before he gave himself that final second of stillness. And outside, the men waited, not restless, not shifting, just there, like they had all the time in the world, and that told him more than anything else could, and slowly, he pulled the door open, the hinges giving a low protest as it swung inward, revealing the figures standing on his porch, 6 men, maybe more just beyond, their faces worn by travel, their eyes fixed on him with a kind of expectation that did not need to be spoken, and the one at the front stepped forward just enough to make himself clear, his gaze sharp, assessing, taking in Ethan from hat to boots, then flicking briefly past him into the dim interior of the house before returning, and he spoke again, not asking this time, but stating, as if the truth had already been decided, and Ethan stood there in the doorway, silent as always, giving nothing back, not agreement, not denial, just presence, and for a moment the air tightened, stretched thin between what was said and what was not, and behind him, the faint sound of movement from the bed broke that tension just slightly, enough to shift the attention of the men on the porch, enough to change the direction of the moment, and Ethan did not step aside, did not turn, did not explain, he simply stood where he was, a quiet barrier drawn in wooden shadow, and in that stillness, without a single word spoken, it became clear that whatever these men had come for, they were not stepping past him without consequence, even if that consequence had no name, no sound, and no warning. The man on the porch did not step back, did not raise his voice, did not need to, because the kind of authority he carried was not in how loud he spoke but in how certain he sounded. And he tilted his head slightly, studying Ethan as if trying to understand what kind of man would stand there without answering, without reacting, without giving even the smallest sign of cooperation, and the others behind him shifted just enough to show they were not uncertain, just waiting, like men who had done this before, like men who expected doors to open wider than this, and the leader spoke again, slower this time, his words measured, each one placed carefully into the silence. Explaining just enough to make the situation clear without offering any kindness in it, saying they were looking for a woman, describing her in broad strokes that did not need precision, because there were not many who would match the description out here, and Ethan listened, not with his ears alone but with the stillness of his entire body, taking in every detail without moving a muscle, and behind him, the air shifted again. The faint sound of fabric brushing against wood, of someone sitting up more fully now, and the men on the porch caught it too, their eyes flicking past Ethan again, sharper this time, more focused, and the leader's expression changed just slightly, not into anger, not yet, but into something more intent, more certain, and he took one step forward, just enough to test the space, just enough to see if Ethan would yield, and Ethan did not move, not forward, not back, not aside, he simply remained where he was, and that stillness spoke louder than anything he could have said, and for a moment the two men stood facing each other, one asking without asking, the other refusing without speaking, and it was not a confrontation built on noise or force, it was something quieter, heavier, the kind of moment where decisions are made without words, and behind Ethan, she shifted again, this time her voice coming through clearer, low but steady, carrying something that cut through the tension like a blade through cloth, not loud, not pleading, just present, and Ethan closed his eyes for the briefest second, not in hesitation but in recognition, because that voice, even now, carried something familiar in its rhythm, something that did not belong to this moment alone, and when he opened his eyes again, the decision had settled fully into him, not new, not sudden, but complete, and the leader on the porch saw it, even if he did not understand it, saw the way Ethan's stance had changed without movement, saw the line that had been drawn without a word, and he exhaled slowly, as if adjusting to a situation that was not following the path he expected, and he spoke once more, this time not asking, not explaining, but stating what would happen next, laying it out like a fact that did not need agreement, and still Ethan said nothing, offered nothing, but his hand shifted just slightly against the doorframe, not reaching for a weapon, not preparing for anything visible, just grounding himself in the place he had chosen to stand, and that small movement was enough to tell the men on the porch that this was not a man who would be moved easily, not by words, not by presence, and the air between them tightened again, not with noise but with weight, and somewhere in the distance, the wind picked up just enough to carry dust across the yard, blurring the edges of the moment, softening nothing, and inside the house, behind Ethan, she drew in a breath, steady now, controlled, no longer the breath of someone collapsing but of someone choosing, and though she did not stand, though she did not step forward, her presence filled the space just the same, and Ethan remained exactly where he was, silent, unmoving, and yet somehow louder than every word that had been spoken on that porch. The wind moved first, slipping between the men on the porch and into the house like it had something to say but did not know how, and for a long moment no one followed it with words, no one broke the shape of the silence that had settled over everything, and the leader's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, not in confusion, but in calculation, as if he was measuring the distance between what he expected and what stood in front of him. And Ethan remained there, unmoving, his shadow stretched across the doorway, dividing the fading light outside from the dim stillness inside, and behind him, she shifted again, this time pushing herself higher against the bed, not rushing, not panicked, but steady, controlled, her strength returning in quiet increments, and the sound of that movement carried forward, subtle but unmistakable, drawing the attention of every man on the porch. And one of them leaned slightly to the side, trying to see past Ethan without stepping forward, trying to confirm what they already believed, and Ethan adjusted his stance just enough to block the line of sight, not aggressive, not obvious, just enough, and that small motion spoke louder than any refusal, and the leader exhaled slowly, his gaze never leaving Ethan's face, as if searching for something there, a crack, a sign, anything that could be used to turn this moment in his favor, and when he spoke again, his voice softened, not with kindness, but with strategy, shifting from demand to reason, laying out a version of the truth that sounded cleaner than it was, suggesting that what they wanted was simple, that no harm needed to come from any of this, that the woman inside had answers they needed, and Ethan listened, the words passing through the silence around him without finding a place to land, because he had heard men speak like that before, had seen what followed when doors opened too easily, and his expression did not change, not even slightly, and behind him, her voice came again, clearer now, stronger, carrying across the room and into the doorway with a calm that did not match the situation, and though the words were few, They carried weight, enough to make the men on the porch glance at each other, enough to shift something in the air, and Ethan felt it, that shift, like the first sign of a storm changing direction. And for a moment he considered stepping aside, not out of agreement, but because the truth she carried might not belong to him to protect. But then he saw her hand again, the way it held the chain at her neck, not loosely, not absent-mindedly, but with intention, with memory, and something in that gesture anchored him, pulled him back to the line he had already chosen, and the leader saw that too, saw the way Ethan's stillness hardened, not visibly, but undeniably, and the patience in his posture began to thin, not breaking, but tightening, like a rope drawn just a little too far. And the men behind him shifted again, their boots scraping softly against the porch, their presence pressing forward without stepping, and the space between inside and outside narrowed until it felt like a single breath could tip it either way. And Ethan stood there, silent, steady, holding that breath without effort, without fear, as if he had been standing in moments like this his entire life. And behind him, she drew in a slow breath of her own, and though she did not move forward, did not speak again, her presence settled into the space beside him, not physically, but in something deeper, something shared. And for the first time since the men had arrived, it no longer felt like one man standing alone in a doorway. It felt like something else entirely, something quieter, stronger, and far more difficult to move. The silence held, but it was no longer still. It moved between them like something alive, shifting with every breath, every glance, every unspoken choice. And the leader on the porch seemed to feel it too, his patience thinning not into anger but into something colder, more deliberate. And he took a half step closer, not enough to cross the threshold, but enough to test it again, enough to press against the invisible line Ethan had drawn. And this time his voice changed, not louder, not harsher, but sharper, stripped of any pretense of reason, carrying the weight of expectation that had gone unanswered for too long. And behind him, the other men adjusted, not stepping forward, but aligning, their presence tightening like a net that had been cast and was now slowly being pulled in. And Ethan did not move, did not shift, did not even tighten his stance, but something in the way he stood settled deeper, like roots pushing into dry ground. And the porch creaked faintly under the added weight of tension, would responding to something heavier than boots. And inside, the air felt different now, no longer just quiet but charged, carrying the echo of what might happen next even if no one spoke it aloud. And behind Ethan, she drew in another breath, steadier than before, and this time she moved, not just sitting up, but placing her feet on the floor, slow, controlled, her balance returning in measured steps. And the faint sound of her movement reached the doorway, reached the men outside, and one of them leaned again, trying to catch a glimpse, trying to confirm what they already believed. And Ethan shifted just enough once more, blocking without force, without confrontation, just presence, and it was enough to stop that motion, enough to remind them that this was not a space they could enter freely. And the leader's eyes flickered with something then, recognition maybe, not of the man, but of the situation, of the kind of resistance that did not break easily because it was not built on defiance, it was built on decision. And he let out a slow breath, his gaze steady, and spoke again, this time not to persuade, not to reason, but to define, to make clear that what stood inside that house did not belong to it, that it had crossed into something larger than one man's land. And Ethan listened, the words falling into the silence around him and disappearing there, because they did not change anything, not the line, not the choice, not the weight of the moment. And behind him, she took a step forward, just one, her presence now closer, no longer a distant shape in the room but something that existed within the same space, the same breath. And though she did not stand beside him, did not place herself in the doorway, her nearness altered something, made the silence feel shared, not held by one but carried by two. And Ethan felt that, not as a thought, not as a realization, but as something simpler, something immediate, like the way a man knows when he is no longer alone even if no one says it. And outside, the wind shifted again, stronger this time, lifting dust across the yard and around the porch, softening edges, blurring outlines. And for a brief moment the scene lost its sharpness, became something less defined, less certain. And in that moment, the leader stepped back, just slightly, not in retreat, not in surrender, but in recalculation, his eyes still fixed on Ethan, still measuring, still weighing. And the men behind him held their ground, waiting, not for a command, but for the next move in a moment that no longer followed the path they had expected. And Ethan remained exactly where he was, silent, unmoved, the doorway still his, the line still drawn, and For the first time since the riders had arrived, it became clear that whatever happened next would not be decided by force or volume, but by something quieter, something far more difficult to break, something that had already taken hold in the space between them. The porch settled into a quiet that felt older than the wood beneath their feet, a kind of silence that did not belong to any one man but to the land itself, and the leader stood there with his eyes fixed on Ethan, no longer testing the line, no longer pressing against it, but studying it, as if trying to understand what held it in place without words, without force, without anything he could measure or break, and behind him, the men waited, their presence still strong but no longer advancing, like a storm that had reached the edge of something it could not cross without consequence, and the wind eased slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of dry grass and distant earth, grounding the moment in something real, something that existed beyond the tension, and Ethan remained where he was, his hand resting lightly against the doorframe, not gripping it, not bracing, just there, steady, and behind him, she took another step forward, slow but certain, her feet finding balance against the wooden floor as if she had already decided that staying hidden was no longer an option, and the sound of that step reached the porch clearly this time, drawing every eye toward the doorway, toward the space just behind Ethan's shoulder, and for a moment the air shifted again, not with threat, but with anticipation, and she spoke, her voice calm, low, carrying through the doorway with a clarity that did not match the tension around it, and though the words were not many, they held weight, not pleading, not explaining, but stating something that belonged to her, something she would not let others define, and the leader listened, his expression unreadable for the first time since he arrived, as if what she said had not been part of what he expected, and the men behind him exchanged brief glances, subtle, quick, the kind that passed understanding without needing words, and Ethan felt the shift again, deeper this time. Something turning in the space between them, not breaking, not resolving, but changing direction, and he did not turn to look at her, did not acknowledge her with movement, but her presence beside him now was undeniable, no longer behind him, no longer separate, and the silence that followed her voice was different, not empty, not heavy, but filled with something that had not been there before, something closer to truth and tension, and the leader stepped back another inch, just enough to show he was no longer pressing forward, his gaze moving briefly from Ethan to the space behind him and then back again, as if reassessing not just the situation, but the people within it, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, not softened, not weakened, but adjusted, carrying less certainty, more consideration, and the words he chose were fewer, more careful, as if he understood now that this was no longer a simple matter of taking what he came for, and Ethan stood there listening, the silence around him no longer just his, no longer something he held alone, and for the first time since the riders had arrived, the balance of the moment shifted away from them, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that the line in the doorway no longer felt like a barrier that could be pushed, but like something that had to be respected. And the wind moved again, softer now, passing through the open space and carrying the last of the daylight with it as the sky began to dim, and the porch creaked once more under the weight of men who were no longer certain of their next step, and Ethan remained exactly where he was, silent, steady, and beside him, though no one could see it clearly, she stood just close enough that the space between them no longer existed at all. The last light of day slipped fully below the horizon, leaving only a fading glow that traced the edges of the land in muted gold before surrendering to the slow rise of evening, and with it came a shift in the air that no one spoke of but everyone felt, the kind that settles into a moment and makes it final, and the men on the porch stood quieter now, their earlier certainty worn down not by resistance, but by something they could not quite name. Something that did not yield to pressure or force, and the leader remained still, his gaze steady but no longer sharp, as if he had begun to understand that what stood in front of him was not a man refusing out of stubbornness, but a man who had already chosen long before they arrived, and Ethan stood in that same place, his silence unchanged, but no longer empty, no longer something that separated him from the world, now it carried weight, meaning, presence, and beside him, she did not step back, did not hide, her posture steady despite the wear of her journey, her hand resting lightly against the chain at her neck as if it anchored her to something deeper than the moment, and for a long second that stretched into something longer, no one moved, no one spoke, and the quiet between them grew into something that felt almost like understanding, and then the leader exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but enough to mark the turning point, and he stepped back from the doorway, not abruptly, not with frustration, but with a kind of acceptance that settled into his shoulders, and when he spoke again, his voice carried less edge, more distance, as if he had already begun to step away from the moment even while still standing in it, and the words he chose were fewer, not commands, not demands, but something closer to acknowledgement, and the men behind him shifted, not forward, but back, their weight easing from the porch boards, their presence loosening like a storm that had passed without breaking, and one by one they turned, not in retreat, but in decision, their boots pressing into the dirt as they moved away from the house, the sound steady, controlled, and as they mounted their horses, the leather and metal whispered again into the evening, softer now, less certain, and the leader was the last to turn, his eyes lingering on Ethan. For a moment longer, not searching anymore, not measuring, just seeing, and then he nodded once, a small motion, almost imperceptible, before stepping away fully, and the distance between them widened with each step, with each breath, until the space that had been so tight, so heavy, began to open again, and Ethan did not follow, did not step forward, did not watch them leave for long, because he did not need to. He had already felt the moment pass, and slowly, he reached for the door, his hand resting against the worn wood as he began to close it, the hinges giving that same low sound as before, and as the door moved inward, the last of the outside world slipped away with it, leaving only the quiet of the house behind, and when it closed fully, the silence returned, but it was no longer the same silence that had filled the space before she arrived. It carried something now, something shared, something changed, and Ethan stood there for a moment longer, his hand still resting against the door, before turning back into the room, toward the woman who now stood a few steps behind him, no longer hidden, no longer distant, and for the first time since she had crossed onto his land, the space between them held no question, no tension, just a quiet understanding that did not need to be spoken, and in that stillness, something settled into place, not loudly, not suddenly, but in a way that could not be undone. The door settled into its frame with a soft final sound, and the house seemed to breathe again, not with relief, but with a quiet recognition that something inside it had shifted and would not return to what it was before, and Ethan stood there for a moment longer, his hand still resting against the wood, feeling the faint vibration fade beneath his palm as the outside world pulled further away, and behind him, she remained still, not out of fear, not out of uncertainty, but because she understood that some moments needed to settle before anything else could follow, and the silence between them stretched, not heavy, not tense, but full, like the pause between two notes that only made sense together, and slowly, Ethan turned, his movement unhurried, his gaze meeting hers again in the dim light that now belonged entirely to the room, and for the first time since she had opened her eyes, there was no barrier between them, no door, no line, no men waiting outside, just space. Shared and quiet, and she studied him with the same steady attention she had shown before, her eyes sharp but no longer guarded in the same way, as if something about what had just happened had shifted her understanding of him, and her hand rested once more against the chain at her neck, her fingers brushing over it lightly, not out of habit this time, but with intention, and Ethan saw it, saw the way she held it, and this time he did not look away. And without thinking, without planning, he took a step closer, closing the distance by just enough to make the moment real, and his hand lifted slightly, not reaching, not touching, just present in the space between them, and her gaze followed that movement, not with fear, but with awareness, and for a second that seemed longer than it was, the two of them stood there in a silence that felt different from anything that had come before, because this silence was not about holding something back, it was about letting something exist without needing to explain it, and then she spoke, her voice low but clear, carrying through the room with a steadiness that did not ask for permission, and she said his name, not as a question, not as a guess, but as something she already knew, and Ethan's breath caught, just slightly, just enough to be felt more than heard, because he had not heard his name spoken like that in a long time, not with recognition, not with certainty, and something in his chest shifted, something small but undeniable, and he looked at her more closely now, not as someone who had arrived on his land, not as someone who had brought trouble to his door, but as someone who stood in front of him with a connection he could not yet explain, and her fingers tightened slightly around the chain, and she lifted it just enough for him to see it clearly, the worn silver catching the low light, the same marking he had seen before now unmistakable, and she spoke again, quieter this time, her words carrying memory, not just from her, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere shared, and Ethan felt it then, fully, not just a flicker, not just a hint, but a memory breaking through the silence he had built around himself, a face from years ago, a voice that had once filled his life before it had gone quiet, before everything had changed, and the chain in her hand was not just an object anymore. It was a bridge, a thread pulled tight across time, and Ethan's hand moved without thought, rising slowly until it hovered just beside the chain, close enough to feel its presence. And for a moment he hesitated, not because he did not want to touch it, but because he understood what it meant if he did, and then, slowly, he let his fingers brush against the metal, and the moment his skin met it, something inside him shifted completely, not loudly, not violently, but in a way that made everything else fall quiet, and for the first time in years, the silence he had carried no longer felt like something he was holding onto, it felt like something he was ready to let go. His fingers rested against the silver for only a moment, but it was enough to pull something buried up from a place he had kept sealed for years, and the room seemed to shift around him, not in sound, not in light, but in memory, quiet and persistent, and he saw it again, not clearly, not all at once, but in fragments that carried more weight than anything whole. A woman standing in the same doorway long ago, her voice soft but certain, her hand placing that very chain into his, telling him something he had not been ready to hear even then, something about trust, about crossing lines that were never meant to divide people the way they did, and he had not answered her then either, had let the silence take the place of what he could not say, and that silence had followed him ever since, growing, hardening, until it became the only language he knew how to live with, and now it stood between him and this moment, thinner than it had ever been, fragile in a way he had not expected. And he drew his hand back slowly, not breaking the connection, but understanding it fully now, and she watched him, her eyes steady, not demanding, not searching for anything he was not ready to give, but holding that same quiet certainty she had carried since she woke, as if she had known from the beginning that this was not about what he would say, but about whether he would choose to say it at all. And the chain slipped back against her collarbone as her hand lowered, and the space between them felt smaller now. Not because they had moved closer, but because something unspoken had already crossed it, and Ethan stood there, his chest rising slightly with a breath that felt different from the ones before, deeper, heavier, like it carried something more than air, and for the first time in years, he did not push it down, did not force it back into silence, and the room held still around him, the old boards, the cracked window, the quiet corners that had known nothing but his absence of words, and now waited for something else, something new, and she spoke again, her voice softer now, not because it lacked strength, but because it no longer needed to reach through distance. It was already there, already part of the space they shared, and she said a name that was not his, not hers, but belonged to the memory between them, and it settled into the room like something returned after a long absence. And Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, not to escape it, but to feel it fully, to let it exist without turning away, and when he opened them again, the silence that had defined him for so long no longer felt like protection, it felt like something he had been hiding inside, and slowly, almost without realizing the exact moment it began, he let out a breath that carried more than air, it carried intention, it carried decision, and his lips parted slightly, not forced, not struggling, just opening to something that had been waiting, and though no sound came yet, the change was already there, already real, and she saw it, understood it without needing to hear it, and her expression softened, not into relief, not into victory, but into recognition, as if this moment had never belonged to either of them alone, but to something that had been moving toward them both from the very beginning. And outside, the wind moved across the land once more, quieter now, no longer carrying tension or expectation, just passing through as it always had, and inside, Ethan Cole stood on the edge of breaking his silence, not because he had to, not because anyone demanded it, but because for the first time, he was no longer afraid of what might come after the words. The air held steady, as if the world itself had paused to listen to something that had not yet been said, and Ethan stood there with his breath still caught halfway between silence and sound, his chest rising slowly as the weight of years pressed against a moment that could no longer be held back, and the room felt smaller now, not confined, but focused, everything drawn into that single space between him and the woman standing just a few feet away, her eyes steady on his, not urging, not expecting, just present, and it was that presence, quiet and unwavering, that gave the moment its shape, not force, not urgency, just permission, and Ethan's lips parted again, this time not in hesitation, but in choice, and the sound that followed was not loud, not strong, but real, fragile in its return yet undeniable, his voice breaking through years of silence like something long buried finally finding its way back to the surface, and he spoke her name. Not as a question, not as a test, but as recognition. And the word settled into the room with a weight that no silence had ever carried, and she closed her eyes for a brief second, not in relief, not in surprise, but in something deeper, something that acknowledged the moment for what it was, not the beginning of something new, but the return of something that had never fully disappeared, and when she opened them again, the distance that had once existed between them was gone completely, replaced by something quieter, stronger, something that did not need to be defined to be understood. And Ethan stood there, his voice still lingering in the air, not rushing to fill the space with more words, not trying to explain what had just happened, because he understood now that it was not the number of words that mattered, it was the moment they chose to exist, and outside, the land stretched on as it always had, the wind moving softly across the open fields, the dust settling back into place, the world continuing without interruption, but inside that small, worn house, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and Ethan took a slow breath, deeper now, steadier, as if the act of speaking had lifted something from him that he had carried too long, and he did not look away from her, did not retreat back into the silence that had once defined him, because that silence no longer held the same meaning, it was no longer a wall, no longer a shield. It had become something else entirely, something that could exist alongside words rather than replace them, and she lowered her hand from the chain at her neck, letting it rest naturally against her collarbone, no longer gripping it as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded, because now there was something else, something shared, something that stood between them without needing to be held, and for a moment they simply stood there, not speaking, not moving, letting the quiet settle around them again, but this time it was not empty, it was full, filled with understanding, with memory, with something that had been waiting to return, and the house, with its worn boards and quiet corners, seemed to hold that moment gently, as if it understood that not all change needed to be loud to be lasting, and Ethan Cole, who had lived for years without a single word, now stood in a silence that no longer belonged to the past, but to something new, something chosen, and out here, where the land stretched wide and unforgiving, where men measured strength in what they could endure, it turned out that sometimes the strongest thing a man could do was not to remain silent, but to finally speak when it mattered most.